Hello and welcome to the Wisdom Workshop. Please like the video and subscribe with all notifications turned on so that you won't miss any of our wisdom improving videos. North Korea is the world's most isolated nation. This Asian country is often the subject of great attention because of its aggressive military displays, its nuclear program, which is widely denounced, and of course its repressive authoritarian rule. The severe extent and type of these human rights crimes are unmatched in this modern world, according to a 2014 United Nations assessment. With the exception of human rights, all of this evidence is quite damning, but the North Korean leadership is not especially ashamed of these forceful measures. They're ashamed of their really pitiful economy, which is something that all of these media shows serve to obscure. North Korea's economy is estimated to have a nominal GDP of 25 billion US dollars, or a purchasing power parity GDP of 40 billion US dollars. This is actually a very difficult number to calculate because there's a severe lack of accurate economic data for the country, and because you have to take into account the value of the North Korean won, which is essentially a currency with no international value and no foreign exchange market. However, this assessment does indicate that North Korea's transactional economy is less developed than somewhere like Beverly Hills, Los Angeles. Of course, North Korea does invest a significant percentage of that revenue in its military, rather than in designer handbags or rodent-sized canines, but it still puts the entire country in perspective. Despite all of the possibilities this country has been given, it has slipped into total economic oblivion outside of the spectacular chest pounding. Though we must begin at the very beginning in order to fully comprehend this tragic letdown. After years of destructive back-and-forth struggle between the emerging political ideas that would go on to dominate the latter half of the 20th century, the Korean War concluded in July 1953, leaving the Korean peninsula essentially where it had started. The capitalist nation is in the south, while the new communist nation is in the north, along the 38th parallel. After recovering from the atrocities of the Korean War, North Korea was really able to make a very solid start. North Korea was able to recover and begin to develop at an astonishing rate thanks to its assistance from its communist neighbors China and the Soviet Union gaining ground swiftly on their neighbor to the south with a similar name. The planned command economy used by the North Korean government meant that the government had complete control over all aspects of production, investment, and the distribution of capital goods. Once more, this was highly reminiscent of their communist partners China and the Soviet Union. The Supreme People's Assembly of Korea would deliberate on a series of 5-year plans, which would eventually be transformed into a legally binding final plan to guide the centrally controlled economy after the war. Initially, these plans would focus on things like the construction of ports, raising grain yields, signing trade deals, and of course, expanding the military. North Korea actually had a lot going on for them in the early post-war years. Even though it was at a very low position, it was able to trade with its communist allies for their plentiful natural resources, and in return, they would provide North Korea technical products and industrial know-how to help it transform from a primitive agricultural nation into an industrial powerhouse. But in the middle of the 1960s, everything began to slow down. The Fourth Central Plan was being implemented in North Korea. This time, a very ambitious 7-year plan to industrialize and raise living standards was being implemented, but for the first time since the plan's inception, it was becoming apparent that North Korea would not be able to achieve this high goal. While they were all friendly communist countries, there was a general decline in Soviet support during this period as North Korea began to ally more with China. It was similar to choosing which parent you loved more because they were all communist countries. Given the rising pressure from capitalist countries like the United States, who were determined to halt the communist domino effect, which was the theory that communism would spread from one nation to another like dominoes, North Korea was under a lot of pressure to expand its defense budget, and then in 1965, despite all of its advantages and despite having a smaller total economy at the time, South Korea for the first time exceeded North Korea's pace of economic development. In the late 1970s, the minor issue of decreasing growth finally developed into a serious catastrophe. North Korea was still able to raise money through government borrowing at this point, but it had racked up significant debt in an effort to keep up with these ambitious objectives. If the funds had been used to build useful infrastructure, this wouldn't necessarily have been a terrible idea, but by this point, North Korea was investing up to 25% of its budget in its military. North Korea's spending actually doesn't sound that awful when compared to the USA, a nation with a large military budget, which devotes around 54% of its federal budget to military expenditures. However, two factors need to be taken into account in this case. Firstly, in the US, state budgets are also used to pay for things like local police, roads, schools, and other things. The actual military expenditure is not as bad as it seems, really making up slightly under 30% of total government spending overall, with state and local budgets accounting for nearly 50% of total government expenditures in the United States. There are no state finances in North Korea. Although it has provinces, the entire economy is supported by a single national budget. Therefore, the 25% statistic from the 1970s reflected the complete picture. Secondly, the United States doesn't have a centrally planned economy, and only around 9% of the nation's overall production is accounted for by federal government spending. Statistic indicates that the United States military spending in 2018 was barely 3.2% of its entire GDP. In North Korea, which has a centrally planned economy, the government's budget functions as the country's economy in a sense, and at this time, military spending made up around 20% of the country's overall GDP. North Korea defaulted on its obligations in 1980 as a result of its economic mismanagement and careless military expenditures, which prevented it from borrowing money to stay afloat. Because of these financial issues and the widespread drought that was afflicting the country at the time, its neighbor to the south was easily able to overtake it economically and continue to develop into what it is today. North Korea suffered for the remainder of the 1980s, primarily depending on China and the Soviet Union to provide for its citizens' needs and maintain its infrastructure. In reality, these nations were more than willing to assist in exchange for more of North Korea's natural resources. They also did so in an effort to convince the rest of the world that communism was the way of the future and that central planning was legitimate and did not cause widespread starvation. If things for North Korea couldn't get any worse, they did. When the Soviet Union fell apart in 1991, North Korea lost its main source of support. North Korea had to make significant adjustments, and 2 years later it unveiled a new financial blueprint. A 3-year strategy this time, with an emphasis on agriculture, light industry, and international trade. All of this sounded wonderful, but it essentially followed the same course as all of the prior economic programs. Fertilizer supplies that were previously provided to North Korea by the Soviet Union were no longer available in adequate quantities. Its crippling foreign debt, insufficient domestic production, and lack of trade made investments in infrastructure all but useless. North Korea was also unable to produce the machinery needed in its own country because of the lack of technical expertise, and it was unable to import machinery because no one wanted to do business with them. As a result, its trade agreements failed. In the modern world, a tiny economy like North Korea's lack of commerce is essentially a death sentence. North Korea at this period was eager to attempt anything to boost its economy, even if it meant turning to the thing that it detested the most. North Korea's leadership was experimenting with the notion of private sector in an effort to modernize its economy, but it was doing it in a distinctly North Korean manner. Small-scale entrepreneurship was experimented with between 2009 and 2013. And even if there are still legal concerns, this industry has grown significantly. By 2016, economic liberalization had advanced to the point where both locally accountable and state industrial enterprises shared 20% to 50% of their total output with the state, while selling the remaining production to purchase raw materials at market-based prices similar to those found in a typical free market. The Enterprise Act was changed in 2014 to let managers of state-owned businesses engage in international business and joint ventures as well as accept investments from domestic non-government sources. Underneath the new regulations, enterprise directors became more akin to Western chief executive officers, and chief engineers, previously a government job, had an operational role more like a Western chief operating officer. These people may even gain personally by running these operations effectively. However, it's unknown as of 2019 if these hybrid public-private entities are still in existence. North Korea is currently stuck in a dead end. Its economy has really begun to deteriorate, and because of its escalating militaristic chess comebacks, more and more sanctions are being imposed on it. further strangling an already fragile economy. For comparison, South Korea, which established itself in the same situation as North Korea following the 1953 Korean War, lacked the same natural resources, did not have a land connection to a powerful ally like North Korea does with China, and did not receive as many extensions of foreign aid and debt relief programs as North Korea did. Nonetheless, South Korea's economy is now over 60 times larger than North Korea's because it allowed private enterprises to assist and support the large industries it has right now. South Korea also achieved this progress while growing up with a nasty neighbor that continually threatened to bomb them, adding to the credit for the difference between the two systems. So, what does North Korea's future hold? Well, it's pretty hard to say. North Korea's administration appears to be trapped in a loop of increasing military aggression before turning around and pleading for more international help in return for a little more restraint. It is the crying youngster that receives a piece of candy in the midst of a store in order to settle them down. The government of North Korea is likely to continue doing this as long as it continues to function. And in the meanwhile, the rest of the world can only watch and hope that the entire system will crumble quietly and decent governance can take its place. Thank you so much for watching this video. Please like this video if you thoroughly enjoyed it and subscribe with all notifications turned on.